To the rest of the world, Julian Vance was a masterclass in modern devotion. When he looked at Evelyn across the mahogany tables of high society galas, his dark eyes softened with an intensity that made society columnists swoon. When he pulled her chair out, his touch was lingering, deliberate, and fiercely protective. On the evening of their 6-month anniversary, captured by a dozen flashbulbs on the steps of the Metropolitan Opera, Julian had cupped Evelyn's face and whispered, "My life began the day I swore to protect yours." The crowd had erupted in gentle sighs. The morning papers called them a modern fairy tale. None of them knew the truth. None of them saw the glass of champagne slip from Evelyn's trembling fingers the moment the heavy oak doors of their penthouse clicked shut, locking the rest of the world out. Chapter 1. The contract had smelled faintly of dry ink and impending ruin. 6 months ago, Evelyn had been drowning. Following the sudden, suspicious death of her father, Arthur Vance, no relation to the ruthless Vance conglomerate, a bitter irony that still stung, the family's architectural firm, Sterling and Davis, was moments away from total liquidation. Her father's younger brother, Richard, had panicked. Burdened by corporate debt and his own gambling debts, Richard had seized upon the unsolicited buyout offer presented by Julian Vance, the 34-year-old billionaire titan known in financial circles as the autocrat. Julian's condition for saving the firm had been impossibly specific, entirely absurd, and chillingly absolute: a marriage of convenience to Arthur's eldest daughter, Evelyn, lasting precisely 3 years, to be conducted under the public guise of an impassioned romance. Richard had signed away his niece's autonomy with a flick of a cheap ballpoint pen, desperate to save his own skin. He hadn't bothered to look into Julian's past. He hadn't asked why a man who owned half the skyline of the city would care about a mid-tier architectural heritage firm. Evelyn had signed it because she believed she was preserving her father's legacy. She thought she was falling on her sword to save the drafting tables where her father had spent his life sketching cathedrals and bridges. She sat now on the edge of the velvet chaise in the penthouse master suite, still wearing the emerald-encrusted necklace Julian had bought her for the gala. The jewels felt less like a gift and more like a heavy iron collar. The heavy click of the study door unlatched. Footsteps approached, measured, silent, lethal in their precision. Julian walked into the bedroom, loosening his silk tie with one hand. The public warmth vanished from his features, replaced by the cold, chiseled marble of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "You played your part well tonight, Evelyn," Julian said, his voice dropping into that low, flat register he reserved exclusively for her. The board members from Vanguard Industries were entirely convinced. "They think I'm a man deeply in love with his fragile, beautiful bride." Evelyn stood up, her spine stiffening. The exhaustion in her bones warred with a simmering, quiet fury. "I played the part because that was the bargain, Julian. Just like I sat through the interviews. Just like I smiled for the cameras. But we are alone now. You don't need to practice your performance." Julian stopped 3 paces away. He didn't blink. "It's never a performance, my dear. It's a strategy. And tonight, Phase 2 concluded successfully." Phase 2. Evelyn's breath hitched. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, twisted in her stomach. "What do you mean, Phase 2? Julian walked over to his minimalist mahogany desk, picked up a sleek, leather-bound portfolio, and tossed it onto the glass coffee table between them. The pages fell open, displaying legal seals, signatures, and corporate transfer documents. "Sterling and Davis," Julian said softly, leaning against the edge of the table. "Your father's life work. The historic building on 4th Street, the patents, the municipal contracts, the land deeds. As of 5 p.m. today, the final asset transfer was executed." Evelyn stared at the papers. Her world tilted on its axis. "No, that's impossible. The contract stated the firm would be held in a joint trust until the 3-year term expired. Richard showed me." "Richard is a fool who reads only what is placed directly beneath his nose," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, devoid of human warmth. "Richard didn't read the addendum on page 14. The one written in legal microcode. Your uncle traded your father's company for a clearance on his private debts, and I bought those debts 6 months before I ever laid eyes on you." Evelyn staggered backward, her hand flying to her mouth. A sharp gasp tore through her throat. You planned this. Before we even met. Before my father died, Julian tilted his head, his expression chillingly clinical. Your father was a stubborn obstacle, Evelyn. He held the intellectual property rights to the city's central transit grid expansion, rights that stood directly in the path of my urban acquisition project. He refused to sell. He threatened to expose my development cartel to the Federal Trade Commission. The room seemed to spin. The air turned heavy, suffocating. And his death, Evelyn whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The brake failure on his car, the police ruled it an accident, but accidents are simply failures of preparation, Julian said smoothly, stepping closer. He drove a vintage sedan with notoriously delicate steering lines. A clever mechanic can weaken a bolt so that it holds through city traffic, but snaps the moment it hits a sharp mountain curve. A very clean, very quiet solution. Evelyn let out a raw, choked sound of absolute horror. She stumbled back until the back of her knees hit the edge of the bed, her eyes wide, locked onto the man she had shared a roof with for half a year. You're a monster, she breathed, the realization slamming into her with the force of a physical blow. You murdered him. You murdered my father, and then you trapped me in this house, pretending to be my husband, just so you could finish stealing what was left of his name. Julian reached out, his long fingers closing firmly around her wrist. His grip was unyielding, cold as forged steel. I am a businessman, Julian corrected, his face inches from hers, his eyes dead and dark as a winter ocean. And you were legally, bindingly, irrevocably mine for another 30 months. You will keep smiling for the cameras, Evelyn. You will keep playing the adoring wife. Because if you shed a single tear in public, or whisper a single word of this to anyone, I will dismantle what remains of your father's legacy brick by brick, and throw your precious uncle into a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud. He let go of her wrist as if dropping something foul, turned his back, and walked toward the private elevator. Sleep well, my love, Julian muttered without turning around. We have a charity gala tomorrow night, and your dress is arriving at noon. The elevator doors slid shut. Evelyn slid down the edge of the bed until she hit the cold hardwood floor. The silence of the massive penthouse pressed down on her chest like a slab of concrete. There were no cameras here. No adoring fans. No flashbulbs to blind the dark. For the first time in 6 months, Evelyn stopped crying. A cold, bitter resolve crystallized in the wreckage of her heart. Julian Vance thought he had caged a bird. He didn't realize he had invited a blade into his house. Chapter 2. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance Tower corporate suite 3 days later. Below, the city sprawled out in a grid of gray concrete and blurred taillights. Evelyn sat across the desk from Marcus Vance, Julian's cousin and the chief financial officer of Vance Enterprises, a man who had spent his entire life terrified of the monster who shared his last name. Marcus kept glancing nervously toward the frosted glass door, as if expecting Julian to materialize through it. You shouldn't be here, Evelyn, Marcus whispered, his voice trembling as he slid a thick manila folder across the blotter. If Julian finds out I let you access the internal server logs, he'll ruin me. He ruined my brother for looking at the wrong financial ledger 3 years ago. I don't care what Julian will do, Marcus, Evelyn said, her voice eerily calm. The panic of 3 nights ago had burned away, leaving behind a sharp, focused cinder. He killed my father. He used a compromised steering column on Arthur Vance's sedan on November 14th. I need the digital telemetry reports from the municipal traffic cameras on that highway. The ones Julian had scrubbed from the police database. Marcus paled, nearly dropping his pen. How could you possibly know about that? The traffic logs were encrypted at the municipal server level. Only someone with root-level admin keys. Only Julian, Evelyn finished for him, leaning forward. Which means the deletion traces are still sitting in the legacy backups of the city's old transit server. Servers that Marcus Vance, as chief financial officer, still has backdoor access to. Marcus shook his head violently, backing his chair away from the desk. No way. Julian keeps tabs on every byte that moves through this network. If I pull those logs, an automated security protocol flags it within 90 seconds. We'll both be dead before midnight. Before Evelyn could reply, the heavy oak door of the office swung open with a slow, deliberate click. Julian stood in the doorway, his umbrella dripping rainwater onto the pristine marble tiles. He didn't look wet, he looked untouchable. His sharp gaze flicked from Marcus's terrified, sweating face to the manila folder half open on the desk, and finally settled on Evelyn. A slow, terrifying smile curved the corner of Julian's mouth. "Working late on corporate archiving, darling?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with smooth, venomous sarcasm. "Or are you helping my dear cousin understand the intricacies of our family assets?" Marcus let out a strangled gasp, half rising from his chair. "Julian, I swear to God, we were just..." Julian didn't look at Marcus. He raised his right hand, snapping his fingers once. From the hallway behind him, two towering security guards in charcoal suits stepped into the room, their expressions blank, their bulk filling the doorway. "Marcus," Julian said softly, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. "Pack your office. Your contract with Vance Enterprises is terminated effective immediately. Your shares are forfeit, and your security clearance is revoked. If you are within 50 miles of this building by sunrise, you won't have to worry about financial ledgers ever again." Marcus didn't hesitate. He scrambled out of his chair, grabbed his coat, and bolted past the guards without a single backward glance, the door clicking shut behind him in the heavy silence. Evelyn didn't move. She stood up slowly from her chair, smoothing the fabric of her wool blazer, and met Julian's dark, fathomless gaze head-on. "You love playing God, don't you?" Evelyn said, her voice steady as a rock. Julian closed the distance between them with terrifying speed, stopping just inches away. The scent of rain and expensive sandalwood filled the space between them. He reached out, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jawline with a touch that looked like adoration to anyone watching from behind a glass wall. "I don't play God, Evelyn," Julian whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "I am simply the architect of this room. And you are playing a very dangerous game with structural integrity." "You killed my father," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that lacked any trace of fear. "You think you covered every track, Julian. You think because you bought the judges, scrubbed the servers, and trapped me in a gilded cage that you won. But you made one critical mistake." Julian's thumb stopped moving. His dark eyes narrowed slightly. "And what is that, my love?" "You left me alive," Evelyn replied, her eyes flashing with a cold, blinding light. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in the depths of Julian Vance's eyes, not anger, but a sudden, sharp spike of intense curiosity, like a predator realizing its prey had grown teeth. Then, his smile returned, cold and absolute. "We shall see, Mrs. Vance," he murmured, stepping back. "We shall see." Chapter 3. The annual Vance Charity Gala was the social event of the winter season. The grand ballroom of the Grand Regent Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, and the cream of the city's elite. Evelyn descended the sweeping marble staircase on Julian's arm, wearing a backless gown of midnight blue silk that hugged her figure like liquid shadow. Cameras flashed like lightning storms. Reporters shouted questions about their marriage, their foundation, their apparent picture-perfect bliss. Julian smiled, waving lazily to the press, his hand resting firmly on the small of Evelyn's back. To anyone watching, it was the touch of a devoted husband cherishing his wife. To Evelyn, it was the grip of a shackle reminding her of where the chains were anchored. As they reached the floor, the CEO of Vanguard Industries, their primary corporate rival and financial backer, approached them with a raised glass of champagne. "Julian, Evelyn," the older man boomed, clapping Julian on the shoulder. "I must say, watching the two of you, it's refreshing to see a modern marriage built on such genuine mutual adoration. The rumors floating around financial circles about a hostile takeover of Sterling and Davis must be absolute nonsense when I look at the two of you." Evelyn felt the muscles in Julian's back tighten beneath his tuxedo jacket. Before Julian could open his mouth to deliver his rehearsed, charming response, Evelyn stepped forward, her smile radiant, luminous, and entirely hollow. "Oh, Robert, you give us too much credit," Evelyn said, her voice carrying clearly across the quieted circle of elites. "A marriage like ours isn't built on simple adoration. It's built on leverage. On ironclad contracts. On the kind of absolute ownership where one party holds all the cards, and the other has nowhere left to run." The surrounding guests chuckled politely, assuming it was upper-crust dry humor. Robert laughed heartily. "Ah, the brutal honesty of a power couple. You keep him in line, Evelyn." Julian's hand on her back tightened until his fingers nearly bruised her spine. His dark eyes burned down at her, a silent, murderous warning flashing in their depths. The polite smile on his face never wavered, but his voice, when he spoke, was a lethal hiss. "You are testing your boundaries, Evelyn," Julian murmured, his lips barely moving as he smiled for the cameras. "Step out of line one more time tonight, and I will destroy every last blueprint your father ever drew, starting with the historical archive downtown." Evelyn didn't flinch. She turned her head slightly, looking up into the eyes of the man who had murdered her father, stolen her legacy, and chained her to his side. "Let's see what you destroy first, Julian," Evelyn whispered back, her smile widening into something terrifyingly bright. "The archive, or your reputation." Before Julian could process her words, Evelyn raised her crystal glass, tapped it lightly with a silver spoon, and turned toward the center of the ballroom where the master of ceremonies stood with a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evelyn's voice rang out clear and bell-like across the silent, glittering hall, amplified by the sound system. "If I could have your attention for just a moment. Before we celebrate the charity auction tonight, my husband has a very special, unannounced presentation to make regarding the future of Sterling and Davis and the truth behind my father's legacy." The entire ballroom went dead silent. 100 heads turned in unison toward Julian Vance. For the first time since the day she had met him, the indomitable, ruthless autocrat, the man who controlled the city, the courts, and the lives of everyone around him, stared at his wife with a look of absolute, unadulterated shock. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding wall of white light, capturing the exact moment the mask finally cracked. Chapter 4. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. The kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic storm. For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic hum of the crystal chandeliers vibrating against the high ceiling. Then, a sharp, collective gasp rippled through the front row of society elites. Flashbulbs stuttered like dying stars, capturing the exact micro-expression of absolute, unshielded fury that flashed across Julian Vance's face before he slammed his control back into place. Julian's smile returned, carved with the precision of a scalpel. He stepped forward, seamlessly slipping his arm back around Evelyn's waist with a grip so tight it felt like an iron vice biting into her ribs. "My wife," Julian spoke into the ambient microphone, his voice smooth as silk and dripping with patronizing affection, "has a wonderful, if slightly dramatic, sense of humor. The stress of managing our upcoming foundation launch has clearly sparked her imagination." A nervous ripple of laughter broke out among the guests. Relief washed over the faces of the board members. They wanted to believe the lie. High society always preferred a comfortable illusion to an ugly truth. Evelyn didn't blink. She turned her head, her lips brushing Julian's ear as she whispered, "The microphone is still live, Julian. Every word you say is feeding the live stream." Julian's jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. His dark eyes turned pitch black, devoid of any human light. "You think you've won an audience," Julian murmured back, his voice a low, venomous hiss that only she could hear. "You've just signed your own execution order." Before Julian could pivot her away from the stage, Evelyn pulled a small flash drive from the hidden seam of her evening glove, reached down, and plugged it directly into the podium's auxiliary audiovisual port, a port linked to the master screen spanning the ballroom walls. "Let's talk about imagination, darling," Evelyn said clearly into the mic. With a single tap on the podium interface, the massive screens behind them flickered from the charity logo to a stark, high-definition digital archive. Financial routing numbers, wire transfers from shell corporations, bank statements linking Vance Enterprises directly to the private accounts of the crooked municipal inspector who had signed off on Arthur Vance's forged vehicle inspection report. And stamped right at the top of the central document, authorization code, J. Vance. The murmur in the ballroom erupted into a deafening wall of chaotic noise. Robert, the CEO of Vanguard Industries, dropped his champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor with a sharp, explosive crack. Reporters began shouting questions over one another, microphones thrust forward like lances. Flashbulbs strobed continuously, painting the scene in stark black and white. Julian let go of her waist. He didn't look at the screens. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Evelyn, a terrifying, manic calm settling over his features. "You want a war, Evelyn?" Julian whispered, his voice dangerously soft above the din of the panicked crowd. "You shall have a war that burns this entire city to ash." Without another word, Julian turned on his heel, cut straight through the parting crowd of stunned socialites, and strode out of the ballroom, his security detail scrambling to keep pace behind him. Chapter 5. By dawn, the financial markets had opened to absolute carnage. Vance Enterprises stock plummeted by 42% within the first 15 minutes of trading. Emergency federal investigators, tipped off by an anonymous data drop synchronized with Evelyn's podium presentation, descended upon the Vance Tower headquarters with search warrants and seizure orders. Evelyn sat alone in the leather-backed chair of her late father's restored office at Sterling and Davis. The historic building, legally reclaimed through emergency injunctions filed by Marcus Vance before midnight, smelled of old paper, mahogany, and dust. The heavy oak door of the office swung open. Marcus stood there, out of breath, clutching a tablet to his chest. "Evelyn, it's happening. The federal grand jury has issued an arrest warrant for Julian. His corporate accounts are frozen. The board is stripping him of his title as CEO." But Julian isn't answering his phone. His private jet left the tarmac an hour ago, destination unknown. Evelyn stood up, walking slowly to the tall arched window that overlooked the rain-slicked city streets. The gray clouds were finally breaking, letting a pale, cold ribbon of morning sunlight slice through the skyscrapers. "He didn't run, Marcus," Evelyn said quietly, her reflection staring back at her in the glass, no longer a frightened girl trapped in a cage, but a survivor standing over the ruins of her captor's empire. "Men like Julian Vance don't run. They hunt." As if on cue, the screen of the office desktop computer flickered to life. An automated video prompt popped up, bypassing all firewall securities. Evelyn stepped closer. She clicked play. Julian's face filled the screen. He was sitting in the dim, leather-lined interior of a private vehicle, the city lights blurring past the windows behind him. He wasn't wearing a tie. His collar was open, his dark hair slightly disheveled, and a cold, feral smile played on his lips. "You managed to tear down my house, Evelyn," Julian's voice echoed softly from the speakers, intimate and chillingly close. "You thought you could cage the monster by breaking his mirrors. But a cage only matters if the animal inside is willing to stay trapped." The video cut to black. Evelyn stared at the blank monitor. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not with fear, but with the sharp, electric adrenaline of a hunt that was only just beginning. She had exposed the monster. She had reclaimed her father's legacy. But as she looked out at the sprawling skyline below her, she knew the true peace she sought would only come when the last shadow of Julian Vance was erased from the earth forever. Chapter 6. 3 weeks had passed since the catastrophic collapse of Vance Enterprises. The federal indictment against Julian Vance was massive, spanning 34 counts of corporate fraud, obstruction of justice, and financial corruption. Yet, the man himself had vanished into thin air. Federal marshals had raided his private island estate in the Caribbean, his chalet in the Swiss Alps, and his underground bunker in Montana, finding only cold coffee, encrypted hard drives wiped clean to the metal, and chilling reminders that Julian was always 3 steps ahead. Evelyn had moved back into her childhood home, throwing herself completely into restoring Sterling and Davis. The drafting tables where her father had spent his life were once again covered in blueprints, scale models, and the quiet, productive energy of a company reborn. Yet, peace remained an elusive phantom. Every time Evelyn walked down the historic corridor of the 4th Street office, every time the shadow of a passing pedestrian fell across the glass pane of her door, the phantom scent of sandalwood and rain prickled the hairs on the back of her neck. She knew Julian was out there. A predator stripped of his territory doesn't slink away to die, he regroups in the dark. It was past midnight. The office was entirely silent, save for the hum of the old server rack in the back corner. Evelyn sat at her desk, rubbing her tired eyes, a cup of cold black coffee sitting untouched beside her laptop. Suddenly, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then died entirely. The emergency backup strips clicked on, bathing the room in an eerie, pulsing amber glow. Evelyn stood up instantly, her hand sliding into the shallow drawer of her desk where she kept a heavy brass paperweight. She moved toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The screen of her desktop computer woke up on its own. There was no video prompt this time. Just a blinking cursor on a blank terminal window, typing words in real time, letter by letter. A house built on glass cannot withstand a storm, Evelyn. Evelyn froze. She spun around, her eyes darting across the dark corners of the office. Show yourself, Julian. You're a coward hiding behind a terminal. The office door clicked. Slowly, deliberately, the brass handle turned down. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing the dim hallway outside. Standing in the threshold, illuminated only by the amber emergency light, was Julian Vance. He looked different. The pristine, tailored Italian suits were gone, replaced by a dark, utilitarian wool coat. His hair was damp from the midnight rain, and his signature cold composure had been stripped away, replaced by something far more dangerous, raw, unadulterated human obsession. I am not hiding, my love, Julian said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like a razor blade. He took a slow step into the office, closing the door behind him with a quiet, final click. I simply traded the boardroom for the wilderness. Evelyn gripped the brass paperweight tighter, her knuckles turning white. She backed up against the edge of the drafting table, her breathing sharp and controlled. You're a fugitive. The entire federal marshal's office is hunting you. The moment I scream, security. Security is currently asleep, thanks to a localized power override, Julian interrupted smoothly, taking another measured step toward her. He didn't look like a man cornered by the law, he looked like a man who had finally cornered his prize. And the marshals, they are chasing ghosts in Zurich. They don't understand that my empire was never about buildings or stocks, Evelyn. He stopped 5 paces away, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air feel thin. It was always about you, Julian whispered. Evelyn let out a harsh, bitter laugh, though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Me. You murdered my father. You trapped me in a contract of slavery. You called that love. I called it possession, Julian corrected, his voice dropping into a low, hypnotic register. You think I destroyed your father because he stood in the way of my development project? No, Evelyn, he stood in the way of us. He was a barrier between what I wanted and what I took. And when I looked at you across those boardrooms, wearing the sorrow of his name like armor, I realized something profound. Julian took another step closer, closing the distance until the heat radiating from him was palpable. You are the only person on this earth who is as ruthless, as resilient, and as cold as I am, Julian said, his gaze burning into her soul. You tore down my entire billion-dollar empire just to watch me fall. No one else in this city would have had the stomach for it. You didn't break my cage, Evelyn, you proved you belong in the wild with me. Evelyn stared up at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. A terrifying realization crept into the edges of her mind, the sickening truth that beneath the horror, beneath the blood and the betrayal, the monster standing before her recognized a kindred spirit in the ruins. She raised the heavy brass paperweight, her arm trembling slightly, pointing it straight at his chest. I don't belong with you, Julian, Evelyn whispered, her voice steadying as the final pieces of her resolve locked into place. I belong over your grave. Julian didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, dark, utterly captivated smile spread across his face. He reached out, not to grab her, but to wrap his hand completely around the heavy brass of the paperweight she was holding against his heart, pulling it forward until the metal pressed directly over his pulse. Then pull the trigger, my love, Julian whispered against her hair, his breath warm and steady. Let's see who survives the fall. Chapter 7. The cold metal of the brass paperweight pressed directly against the center of Julian's chest. Beneath it, Evelyn could feel the steady, rhythmic thud of his heartbeat. It was maddeningly calm, entirely devoid of the frantic terror of a hunted man. You think this is a game, Evelyn whispered, her voice tightening as raw fury surged through her veins. You think because you romanticize your own sickness that it makes you invincible. My father is in the ground. My youth was bartered away on a piece of paper in your office. And you stand here expecting me to yield to your delusion. Julian's gaze never wavered. His dark eyes held hers with a terrifying, absolute intensity. I don't expect you to yield, Evelyn. Yielding is for the weak. I expect you to destroy me, if you can. Before Evelyn could react, Julian lunged forward, not with violence but with calculated precision. He gripped her wrist, guiding her hand upward so the heavy brass struck the glass pane of the drafting table with a deafening crash. Shards of glass scattered across the blueprints. Before she could pull away, Julian's other hand cupped the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, and pulled her into a fierce, suffocating embrace. His lips brushed against her ear, hot and demanding. The federal agents are sweeping the lower levels right now, Julian murmured, his voice a lethal whisper against her skin. They trace my burner phone to this block. You want your freedom, Evelyn. You want your absolute, untainted peace. Evelyn tried to wrench her arm free, her breath catching in her throat. What are you talking about? Julian reached into the deep pocket of his wool coat, pulling out a small, encrypted thumb drive and pressing it hard into her palm, wrapping her fingers tightly around it. This contains the master decryption. Keys to every hidden offshore account, every shell corporation, and every legal confession regarding your father's accident, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register so dark and final it sent a shiver down her spine. Give this to the federal prosecutor waiting downstairs. Tell them I broke into your office, held you at knife point, and that you acted in self-defense when I lunged. Evelyn stared down at the small piece of plastic in her hand, then back up at his face, her breath hitching. Self-defense. Julian, what are you? A monster doesn't get to survive his own reckoning, Evelyn, Julian interrupted, a bitter, haunting smile touching the corners of his mouth. And an empire cannot be rebuilt while its architect still breathes the same air as his victims. If you want peace, you have to execute the final judgment. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed down the stone corridor outside the office door. Heavy boots pounding against the floor. Shouts muffled through the reinforced oak. Federal marshals. Clear the hall. Julian stepped back, releasing her completely. He raised his hand slowly, turning toward the door as the brass handle rattled violently under a sudden, forceful kick. Evelyn stood frozen amid the shattered glass, the cold metal of the flash drive burning in her palm. The ghost was walking back into the cage. The predator was stepping onto the altar of his own destruction. As the heavy door splintered inward, crashing against the interior wall under the weight of federal agents with drawn weapons, Julian threw one final, lingering look over his shoulder. His dark eyes met hers across the chaos, unapologetic, completely devoted to his own ruin, and locked onto hers until the very end. Chapter 8. 6 months later, the city was different. The sprawling glass monolith of Vance Enterprises had been dismantled, rebranded, and absorbed into a public trust dedicated to architectural preservation. Sterling and Davis stood proudly on 4th Street, fully restored, its drafting tables alive with young architects sketching cathedrals and bridges that would stand for generations. The trial of the century had lasted 4 weeks. The evidence provided by the encrypted flash drive had been absolute, airtight, and unanswerable. Julian Vance had been convicted on all counts, sentenced to life without parole in a maximum security federal penitentiary up north. There were no more flashbulbs for Evelyn. No more society galas where she had to wear a smile carved out of glass. No more whispers of adoring devotion masking the terror of the dark. Evelyn stood on the private balcony of her newly renovated penthouse, holding a cup of steaming black coffee. The morning sun broke over the city skyline, washing the concrete towers in a warm, golden light. The wind rustled through her hair, carrying no trace of sandalwood, no echo of rain. She opened her palm, looking down at an empty hand. The chains were gone. The cage was dust. Evelyn took a slow, deep breath of the morning air, closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, found a profound, unshakable peace.